I am the director of Refugee Council USA. We are a DC-based coalition. We have 20 US-based NGOs, and we focus on doing policy advocacy work that increases welcome for refugees, refugee protection, and building excellence in the US refugee resettlement program. And I'm honored to be the moderator for this morning's discussion entitled Voluntary Resettlement Agencies, Perspectives on the Resettlement of Refugees from the Middle East. So what we're going to do is we're not going to do a lot of introductions for our panelists. You have their bios. I'm just going to run through their names and their titles, and then they will each have 10 to 15 minutes, and after that we want to have plenty of time for Q&A. So what we're going to be talking about though today is really a conversation about how resettlement in the United States has been going for refugees from the Middle East, and what communities are doing to welcome refugees, or perhaps in some cases, what they're not doing. This is to discuss the realities of resettlement in the US right now. Our first speaker is Melanie Nezer. She is the Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at HIAS, and she is also the current chair of Refugee Council USA. Our second speaker is William Canny. He is the Executive Director for Migration and Refugee Services at the United States Conference for Catholic Bishops. And then last but not least, we have, I want to make sure to pronounce your name properly. Abdullaziz, who is the Resettlement Program Manager at Catholic Charities in Arlington. So Melanie, it's your turn.
Yeah. I guess I'll stand up here so people can you hear me? No. Is this my phone? All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here. I'm sorry I missed the earlier panels. I'll have to catch up on what happened with those, but I was running a little bit late. So I've been asked to talk about a few things. The first is, so it's the community response in the HIAS network in particular to the refugee crisis in the Middle East. And I thought first I'd explain what the HIAS network is, because some of you may not be familiar with it. So HIAS is, we are the oldest refugee and immigration agency in the world, we think. We were started in the 1880s to assist Jewish migrants and refugees who were coming to Ellis Island, escaping persecution in Europe. And we did that for, unfortunately we had a lot of business, so we were doing that for many, many years through the years after World War II. And then in the 80s and 90s, we're really focused on the resettlement of Jews and others from the former Soviet Union. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, we resettled about 400,000 Jews, evangelicals, and others in partnership with the other resettlement agencies, but we were very actively engaged in that. And then in the last 20 or so years, our mission has remained the same, but we've really broadened our focus. I mean, we got to the point where, fortunately, there were fewer Jewish refugees in the world, and we had to make a decision. Are we going to, become very small and just deal with those few that are left, or are we going to take our literally, 100+ years of expertise, and also, certainly connecting with the tenets of our faith, are we going to then go forward and work with refugees regardless of their faith or their background or where they're from? And that decision was made. So in the last 20 years, we have become just another resettlement agency. We resettle refugees like everybody else from all over the world, regardless of faith or background. We also have an international presence. We provide refugee services. We're actually the largest refugee service provider in Latin America for Colombian refugees. We're in countries in Africa, in Europe, and other countries. So that's a little bit about HIAS. So if you have any questions, we can take those during the Q&A. That's the HIAS network. We're actually one of the smaller resettlement agencies. We have 23 affiliates across the country. We're not everywhere, but we do resettle all the populations. What is our community response? Well, I think you probably talked about, and you've all seen, obviously been following this very closely, the intense attention to refugee resettlement issues in the last 6-8 months or so in this country. Our community response has been overwhelmingly positive, and I think all of the Voleks would probably share the same information. We have had lots of interest from our constituency, from synagogues, from others who have been literally calling up and saying, how do I have a Syrian family in my house? What can I do to volunteer? How do I help? So the response has been really overwhelming. That really happened last summer. That's when it all started, after the images of Alan Kurdi, the toddler who was washed up on the Turkish beach, surfaced, and everyone kind of started to be aware of what kind of a crisis we were dealing with. So, I've actually asked our team that deals with this, and they said we've gotten at least 20,000 calls, just as high as national. So that's a huge number. We've also responded in terms of advocacy. We've done a lot of action alerts. Again, I'm sorry it was this morning. You may have talked about this already, but there were a couple of really nasty bills that made their way through Congress in the last few months. One at the end of the year in the House that actually passed the House that would have effectively shut down the refugee program for Syrians and Iraqis. And then that same bill went through the Senate and did not pass the Senate in January. We had a huge response from our community in terms of action alerts and contacting Congress. And it wasn't obviously just us, but in partnership with all of our colleagues, had a real impact on that legislation, and I think really stopped it cold because it was a political moment where anything could have happened. So there was that. We also put together a letter in November after the Paris attacks, when all the attention on refugees became very negative. We got 1,200 rabbis from around the country to sign a letter in support of resettlement of refugees from the Middle East, and that has actually had a big impact in Washington as well, because it was kind of I think unexpected, but very quickly we were able to garner that kind of support. In terms of some of the challenges, I think sometimes it feels like there are more volunteers than there are refugees. So many people want to help, and we haven't really figured out how to engage. The other challenge, I think, is that so many people want to help Syrian refugees, which is great, but most of the refugees we resettle are from other countries, and they need help too and support. So how do we translate that into a general kind of support for refugees and not just focused on the issue of the day, which of course is very important and critical, but we have this big program, we want to keep it going forward. We want support for refugee resettlement and assistance to grow for all populations. So that's something that we have to kind of work through as well. A couple of anecdotes I was asked to tell. Oh, and I do want to point out also there are tensions in our community, and I think that's true everywhere. I think overwhelmingly, our community has been very supportive, but of course there are voices that are expressing the general fear that people have about particularly this group of refugees, so we have to address that as well. And that's something I think we're all dealing with. Anecdotes, we haven't done much in the way of resettlement of refugees from Syria. I think that's kind of what we're talking about. We've been resettling Iraqis for many years, and that's been going pretty well. But I will say that there was a dinner in Montclair, New Jersey, that it was billed as a traditional Jewish Christmas dinner of Chinese food. And a synagogue invited Syrian refugees and others from the Syrian American community to come and join the members of the synagogue for this dinner. And it went really, really well. I mean, from all reports, by the end of the night, everyone was crying because people were really recognizing the common humanity and the common experiences of our communities. And I'll say from that, because I was actually looking this up last night, I was kind of wondering, well, what happened after that? They actually the synagogue set up a tutoring program, so high school students from the synagogue are actually going to the library and meeting with refugees and tutoring them in English. So there has been follow-up, and there are going to be other dinners. So that's just a sign of how things can go well when we think about creative ways to do that. And I guess in terms of some challenges also, I think this population in particular, and we're talking again specifically about the Syrians, because the displacement was so quick, there's a lot of trauma. One of my colleagues was talking about an interaction she had. She was recently in Lebanon on a trip, and she said that she was talking to this woman who was a Syrian refugee in Lebanon, very nicely dressed and very well spoken, and she just basically looked at my colleague in the face, who's also like, a woman of a similar age, a mother, and she said, I'm you. Like, I had what you had, and now it's all gone. So that is the kind of trauma that is going to take a special kind of approach from those of us who are doing the resettlement. I have some other comments, but I think, am I running out of time? Yeah. Okay. So in terms of, I was also asked to talk about our capacity to welcome and assist these refugees. I think we have it. The question is resources. So how do we garner the resources, not just through appropriations, but also through our own communities? There are a lot of private citizens and businesses and others who want to help. How do we harness that? How do we increase private engagement and resettlement? These are all questions that I think we're going to have to deal with and come up with a plan for, because we don't want to lose momentum. We have a lot of support, a lot of people are interested in helping, and we want to make sure they have a way to plug in and really become engaged. I also want to talk about some unique programs that we have planned. These are not necessarily unique to HIAS, but RCUSA is collecting best practices of how local agencies have really creatively engaged their communities in resettlement. Now there's been so much interest, so hopefully we'll have much more information about that so we can share best practices across the country. And the other thing is a program that we launched, RCUSA members with support of the Kaplan Foundation, called the Lincoln Communities Project, which has been extremely successful. It's been small, but we've launched it in 5 states. And we now have some webinars that we've developed that are specifically aimed at local communities. So, for instance, if you want to do a social media campaign, well, we've learned how to do that, and then we've developed a webinar for you to do that in your community to promote resettlement. Or we've done one on building coalitions and building alliances. We have a couple of others that are coming up as well. So that's a resource that's going to be available to everybody, and some of them are already up on our website. So then the final thing I'll say is that I think at this point we should probably be putting the refugee program in the broader context. We're very focused on refugees from the Middle East, but like I said, and like everybody knows, this is a much broader program. More than half of the refugees that we resettle are Christian. This is a very diverse population. It's not all, one group of people. And we have to, I think, really talk about the diversity of the program and really build support for the program as a whole going forward. So I think it's time to kind of shift the debate. People are still going to be talking about kind of the fear elements, but I think we need to be talking about what this program is really about and build support for it as a whole. So I guess that's it.
Thank you, Melanie. Bill, it's your turn.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'll take my watch off here and keep an eye on the time as well. It was an anticipation that you would, Naomi. Melanie just mentioned RCUSA, Refugee Council USA. We're a proud member. It's a group, a coalition of nonprofits, a bit focused on refugee resettlement, but has a broader humanitarian and advocacy context. Does great work, and Naomi directs it for us, and Melanie leads us in these last couple of years. We're very proud to be part of it. I know some other of our members are here, Errol from Church World Service. It's an excellent organization. I was asked to make some comments concerning Catholic response to the Middle East crisis. Since the Syrian conflict started over 5 years ago, of course, the church has been, like other organizations and churches, extremely involved. I personally don't think it's a bad idea that we and I'll speak as American Catholics, recall our own story in this country, particularly within today's political climate. While not strictly a refugee story, it was not a story of overwhelming welcome. The Catholic immigrant in America had churches burned, were targeted by the KKK, and were discriminated against in hiring. Mexican Catholics who became Americans in 1848 when Mexico lost the war and much of its territory would endure discrimination at work, schools, and in voting rights long after 1848. Catholics shunned by a large swath of America formed their own schools, neighborhoods, and churches. I'm not looking to do anything but move forward here, but I think remembering the pain of discrimination might help us be more compassionate and helping to the newcomer, particularly those of a different faith, such as the Muslims. In September of 2015, the Vatican called a meeting in Rome to discuss the Syrian and Iraq crises, a bit of an unprecedented call. All the humanitarian organizations from around the world. International Catholic organizations such as CRS, Canny, and JRS joined organizations and church leaders from the region to discuss needs and coordination. The Holy Father told the group that, and I quote, "Faced with such a situation and conflicts that are expanding and disturbing in an alarming way, the international community seems unable to find adequate solutions while," and this was an important point I think for us, while the arms dealers continue to achieve their interests. He went on to talk about how the children are so deeply affected by an inability to go to school, and exhorted the group present to work among themselves more closely, as well as with the international community and all people of goodwill to help those suffering. He spoke with passion of the serious harm to the Christian communities in Syria and Iraq, where many brothers and sisters were oppressed because of their faith, driven from the land or kept in prison or even killed. For centuries, he noted, the Christian and Muslim communities have lived together in these lands on the basis of mutual respect. Today, the very legitimacy of the presence of Christians and other religious minorities is denied in the name of a violent fundamentalism claiming to be based on religion. Cardinal McCarrick spoke eloquently to that earlier. In preparation for the Rome meeting, focused on the needs of Syrians and Iraqis, he surveyed 55 Catholic institutions working in the region and found that in the first half of the year in 2015, in 6 months, they had spent some $150 million for 4 million people in need. The meeting, of course, resulted in a pledge to work together more closely, to try and educate the children, and in a spirit of subsidiarity, to develop a priority and prioritize local capacities to deal with the crises and the communities of suffering. Here in the United States, we watched Europe struggle with the march of forced migrants and examined our own responsibilities, as Melanie talked about earlier. The Catholic bishops joined others to call for an extraordinary resettlement of 100,000 Syrian refugees over and above the regular program. Post the Paris attacks, the governors called for a ban on refugees. Bishops of the Catholic faith again responded. Over 25 came out with written public statements supporting the continued resettlement of Syrians. In select states where governors were adamant concerning the stoppage of the refugee program, a number of bishops took it upon themselves to speak with governors directly concerning calls for the suspension of the program. All those efforts, and those of many others, including people in this room and the organizations they represent, did help to tamp down the anti-refugee and immigrant fervor. Ordinary Catholics and others responded to the Holy Father's call to Europeans to take in a refugee family. We, like HIAS, have began to receive numerous queries from lay parishioners, parish priests, nuns, diocesan leadership, asking how they could help. We began to work with approximately 30 dioceses around the country to gauge their capacity and interest to begin a resettlement program. We currently have 10 dioceses that we believe are ready to go, even by September, and another dozen with whom we are investigating the possibility of a resettlement program. The response has been robust. Sister mentioned earlier about some of the Catholic and interfaith activities, and I just wanted to mention her website, refugeesarewelcome.org, where you can go on, and many organizations, HIAS, Church World Service, others belong to this coalition, where you can go on and see how locally you can begin to interact with people of other faiths and refugees in a more perhaps organized way. From its inception in 2010, the USCCB began a program, MRS, called POWER, Parishes Organized to Welcome Refugees. And Mark Franken was actually the person who coined the phrase much before 2010. POWR, we call it. And the 49 MRS resettlement affiliates participating in POWER have made a difference in the lives of some 35,000 refugees from 52 countries. Thousands of volunteers have helped refugees with legal work, medical services and language, offered friendship, warm meals, jobs, and welcomed the newcomers in their parishes. The POWER program goal is to develop long-term sustainable programs. It's supported entirely by unrestricted or private resources. When you examine speaking of private resources in our public-private partnership, when you examine the trends and resources available for refugee resettlement, particularly those allocated for helping refugees find employment, resources have not kept up with costs. The program is more or less on a shoestring, and the pressure from other entrants into the pools of money available at the state level is worrisome for all. Our good colleagues from the government institutions, and some are here charged with managing these resources, do their best to move monies around to meet often changing needs, trying to do more with less. At the same time, a significantly larger share of refugees arriving in the U.S. suffer from complicated medical conditions, including PTSD, war injuries, and illnesses acquired in refugee camps. Agencies providing services to refugees are often spread thin as they provide services to many vulnerable populations, including the urban poor, the elderly, the disabled, and the homeless. The point is, and Melanie mentioned this, more private and volunteering and engagement is both warranted and needed. It is within this context that Migration and Refugee Services Power Program has triggered a number of valued successes. Due to the program, refugees are now on the radar of many more parishioners, deacons, and other community volunteers than we have seen since the Vietnamese resettlement years. For 2 years in a row now, MRS has submitted letters of support, for example, for Catholic Charities of Atlanta, helping the agency obtain $10,000 grant from the Nissan Foundation, which provides matching funds to support refugees and services to them. It has utilized this money to organize refugee camp immersion experiences in an effort to raise awareness for refugees, attract new donors and volunteers. The POWER program has been extremely successful in increasing volunteer support as well as generating local cash and in-kind donations. Analysis of the most recent program cycle shows that diocesan resettlement sites were able to generate $4 for every $1 of funding that we received from the government. As I was reviewing recently the cycle of POWER progress reports, I was heartened to see that the rise of resettlement sentiment was drowned out by an outpouring of support from parish volunteers who wish to make a difference in these uncertain times. Many local programs have been reporting a spike of volunteer interest. I have a couple of narrative accounts. There we go. It's not too bad, 3 minutes. A couple of narrative accounts, and then I'll finish up. And when I say narrative, I want to be as close as possible to what we have heard from these programs. The first success story is from a local program in Atlanta. A volunteer narrates, "It has been such a pleasure to be a family friend to Hassan, Iman, and their 5 children. When I first started visiting with them, we spent time on English vocabulary. Iman had studied English for a year while she was in Syria, so her focus was more on the correct American pronunciation of words. Hassan soon had a job change, so I didn't get to see him as often. As Iman and I got to know each other more, we discovered we both love to cook. She loves to have her family's favorite foods for me to try, and I, in return, bring them some of my family foods. We enjoy talking and tasting over a cup of tea. Iman spent time studying in the evenings for the driver's permit test. Anytime we were in the car together, she would question me on the driving laws. It was a very exciting day when I took her to take the test. She passed on her first try. She was so proud, and I was so happy to be able to be with her. 2 of Hassan's and Iman's children were in elementary school, but the 3 youngest ones are at home when I go to visit. They are always ready to get in my car and go on whatever errands Iman needs to get done. We have done everything from doctor's appointments, WIC appointments, grocery shopping, and visits to Catholic Charities Atlanta. While in the car, the children like to learn English words and sing the ABC song. Although Iman's family and mine come from different religions, We recognize that we love the same God. She asked for my prayers for her family that is still in Syria, and whenever I leave her home, she wishes me the God bless and save your family. It is an honor for me to be her family friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Next up is Abdullaziz, and he's going to be talking about his real on-the-ground experience working with resettled refugees right here in Northern Virginia.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you again. I'm a program manager with Resettlement, program manager for Catholic Charities in Arlington. It's not only, when we say resettlement, I just want to know that some of you may not be familiar with what resettlement program is. It's just a combination of different programs. Within the resettlement program, we have a program called RMB, Reception and Placement. We have a health program. We have employment program. And when you combine all these programs, it's what we call a resettlement. I just wanted to basically start and explain how it works and how, not every program, but just give you an overview of how the programs work and what we do. When families, are coming, we just have like a week or 2 weeks notice. Case managers get their information, and sometimes families can have U.S. ties, friends, family members, that they say that we want to be nearby, or they say that they can help us. Then what we'll do is that we call the U.S. tie, make sure that if he can help us, because with limited resources, we just want families also to have additional help. And then there are other families that don't have U.S. ties, and those we just make sure that we find a housing, and also put furnitures, receive them at the airport when they come, and then at the same time make sure that there's food in the house when they come. Refer them to other benefits that they're supposed to get from the government, whether it's Medicaid, SNAP benefits, and refugee cash assistance. So most of the time, as you know, in Northern Virginia, housing is kind of challenging. So some of the families that have U.S. ties here, will say that, I can only keep the family for 1 week until you guys find a housing for them. But then we know it ahead of time. If we, can secure a house before they come, then we'll do it. If not, then we put the families with the U.S. tie, and then we just make sure that at the same time that they have something to eat. Another thing that comes into mind is that, refugees, when they come here, do they have some kind of, have they been screened here? It's not only the security that people always talk about. Another thing is the public health thing. So when they come here, those with some kind of health concerns, we have their bio. We know if they need a follow-up. But most of our clients don't have any, communicable diseases that needs to follow-up. And then we refer them to the local health departments, make sure that they do another addition, even though they do a health screening overseas. They do it again here. They do TB skin tests and blood tests and all medical checkups. Within the RMB also, I forgot to mention there's another program for the school. It's called VERSA, Virginia Refugee Student Achievement Program. We have 2 people that make sure that kids are also registered, in the schools. Because what we found out is that, as some of the panelists already mentioned, when refugees come here, those with English language ability also have difficulty navigating the system. So we make sure that they get the transportation, appointments, and so that the kids can be enrolled in school. We do this not because we are contractually obligated with the State Department, but we also have staff that are really dedicated and believe in what they're doing. The job that we do is not only from 9 to 5. You have refugees calling us sometimes 1 a.m. in the morning, 12, weekends. So we make sure that we are there for them, and we understand that in a new country, everybody needs help that they can. Now, the programs that we have, especially the employment program, is basically designed because we know that when people come here, R&B program itself alone cannot be sufficient. We know that nobody's gonna be self-sufficient in 1 month, and we know that nobody's gonna sometimes even be able to get their social security even sometimes, even though we try very hard. So these are programs that make sure people, are connected with the employers, and make sure that they get orientation to understand the life here, that they should be self-sufficient soon. Because as many of you may not know or know, the US welfare system here is different than the European and Canadian one. And they come here with high expectations. We explain to them that the US welfare system is geared towards self-sufficiency. You only get a little bit of assistance. For example, one person will if he applies for refugee cash assistance, he will only get $250, depending on the county and the city where he is. With that $250, it's not going to be enough to pay his rent. It's not going to be enough even for transportation sometimes, because it's kind of difficult to survive with $250. In addition to that, he gets food. So we explain to them, if you want to be self-sufficient, we'll put you in our employment program. Make sure we pay that, your rent a few more months, but you should know that you have to be self-sufficient immediately. And amazingly, you find that among our clients, some of them are doctors, others are engineers, others are architects like Mazin, but they still are willing to take any job that's available, whether it's $10 per hour, $9 per hour job. These are people with families and have no choice but just to make sure that they make it in this country. It was my experience as a refugee when I first came here, and it's the experience of almost every refugee that I know. I must say that I'm very, lucky to work with refugees again and doing and helping them. Like when I first came, somebody did that for me, and I hope that I just had to, I wanted to talk more about, the capacity that we have in the state of Virginia, but one of the panels already talked about it. We have, partnership with parishes, social services, health departments, and many other organizations that, even law enforcement is one of them, that are, trying to find out the best way and best practices always to help these people. One of the challenges, as you know in America, is just to make sure that when you develop a resource, how can you make it sustainable? We find housing that, a landlord willing to rent somebody with no social security, no job, no rental history, and then you find that refugees usually, we ask them to give them, because these people are refugees, and we want to give them best choices if they want to move out the area and they feel that they, it's too hard for them to fit in here. To make sure that, that we give them that kind of flexibility, short rent, 3 months, sometimes 6 months. In Northern Virginia, it's kind of difficult, but we still have it. We still have landlords that are willing to do that. We have a resource coordinator in the office who makes sure that that kind of, that we always have housing for our people. We resettled, by the way, this year alone, this fiscal year alone, we resettled 564 people, and our capacity is 600. We are trying to avoid, and we told the people that work with us, that we're not going to accept more than that. We just make sure that we just cap, around 600. So we only have like maybe less than 40 people around that left to settle.